In 1968, people from my village started to go to the United States, and then when they returned, they had different ideas of what they should be doing and so forth. So they began speaking more Spanish than Zapotec. And as more and more people began to migrate, they started teaching their kids Spanish or English, for that matter. When I got to the States, and then I started to get involved in my community, and in around 1990, I went to UCLA, and I realized that just by speaking to people in the States and by going back to my village, I realized that the language was slowly disappearing or becoming more with more Spanish words into it, and then I realized that somehow I needed to do something. By that time, I was at UCLA, and I had met Mike Gallant and Pam Monroe, and then later Brook, and that process, or my worries about the language disappearing was that led me to become involved in preserving the language. So at that instant, I talked to a lot of folks, especially to Pam Monroe, to help me maintain my language, and we worked on a dictionary for about 9 years until we were able to have something that we felt good about, and then we published the dictionary in 1999, and from then on, working with Brook, working with Pam, up to 2005, 2006, where we created a 3-volume of Calichiu in order to teach Zapotec. In 2005, they contacted Pam Monroe in order to ask if she knew somebody who was willing to teach Zapotec at UCSD, and they called me, and Pam referred them to me. So that's when I started. Well, actually, Pam and Brook began working on the book, so in 2005 I began teaching Zapotec at UCSD, and then in 2007 we began the program at UCLA in order to preserve the language. However, one of the things that I think that I have to admit that on the one hand, we started teaching Zapotec to the university population. However, that had nothing to do with the population that actually needed the language. And I came back to Oaxaca about 3 years ago, and about 2 months ago, that I met with the principal of Cebetis and Tlacolula, that they're willing, well, actually they asked me to participate in a program in order for Zapotec to be retained and create a program at a high school level for the valley of Tlacolula. So I think that, as I was talking to Brook earlier, that I think that's one of the projects that is going to have the most impact in the valley of Tlacolula in order to retain the language, because it has several components. In one way, one of the components is the history of the local history. In order to teach kids to retain the language, we need to ask them, I mean, where do they come from? What's their local history, right? Who are they? But not just that. So I think that it's in a sense, I think that's going to have one of the most clear impacts in the population here, because I think that in certain ways, I think that the immigrants in the States, it's really hard for them to maintain the language. But I think the work needs to be here at a local level. And I think that by teaching them the values of their language, the values of the history, or the values of who they are in terms of the worldview, right? I think that we need to begin at that basic level, because a lot of, and I was talking to Brook and said, to some extent, I was kind of disappointed in academia while I was in the States, because yes, that's a good thing that we published the dictionary, but how does that impact the community? Because the first time we presented the dictionary to the community, and then look at everything like, what is it? you know. So I think that what one needs to do is that sort of come at the local level and then get the community involved, get not just the older, but the population, the younger populations. I think that's where we need to impact and sort of instill in them the values of the language, the values of the culture, who they are, the worldview, because, I mean, if they can really appreciate who they are as Zapotecs, I mean, how can you tell them, hey, you need to keep your language? And one of the things that also we need to recognize in Mexico is that language has an economic value, okay? So it is not the same as like if you speak an indigenous language, what is the economic price or the value of it? Spanish, I mean, if you speak Spanish, you can get, I mean, there is the sort of the idea that exists in Oaxaca, for example. They say, okay, so if you speak Zapotec, you know, where does it take you? I mean, can you get a job if you speak Zapotec? No, you can't. However, if you speak Spanish, if you speak English, you know, there is economic value to it. So I think in Mexico, this idea of economic value tied to the language is one of the main obstacles for people to recognize that they have to maintain the language. So as long as they don't recognize the value in terms of non-monetary or non-economic values, it's when we really need to impact the community. So, for example, another example I can give to you is that in Oaxaca, for example, they ridicule indigenous people who don't speak Spanish properly, right? So they said, if somebody speaks Spanish with an accent, an indigenous accent, and they said, "Qué feo habla el español." However, if a European or somebody from the United States comes and speaks probably worse Spanish than indigenous, and they said, "Oh, qué bonito habla el español," right? So what's the message that sends to you? So I think that it's a struggle, because you have everything against you in order to maintain the language. So I think the easiest thing for somebody to is like, to heck with it. I mean, why should I bother maintaining my language? If I speak Spanish or I speak English or any other language that has monetary values, it's easier for me. So we are basically swimming, upstream.